6 hours before Thanksgiving, I learned my in-laws had uninvited me to my own holiday table. I brought the food anyway. Dinner was silent while I slid the divorce papers across the turkey platter. Then my husband called. The call that changed everything did not come from my husband. It came from his sister Petra at 9:14 on a Wednesday morning, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, while I was standing in my kitchen in an apron I'd owned since before my marriage, awk with flour on my forearms and a 17-pound heritage turkey brining in a bucket at my feet. Petra and I had never been close. She communicated in the bright, brittle way of women who have learned to weaponize politeness, but she called often enough that I answered without checking the name. When I picked up, she was quiet for exactly 2 seconds, which is the particular silence of someone who has been dared to make a call they weren't sure they should make. Then she said, "Celeste, I think you should know that Vivienne told everyone you weren't coming tomorrow. She said you and Dominic were having problems and you'd both agreed it was better if you took some space." My hand tightened around my phone. The turkey was brining in a bucket at my feet. I had been cooking for 3 days. "Petra," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, "when did she tell people this?" Another silence. "Monday, at book club. She invited the Forrests and the Aldermans to fill the table." I thanked Petra and hung up and stood in my kitchen for approximately 60 seconds without moving, and then I took off my apron and called my attorney. I had been married to Dominic Hargrove for 7 years when this happened, and for most of those 7 years, I had been performing a version of myself that I can only describe now as managed smallness, the careful accommodation of a woman who has decided, usually unconsciously, that the cost of being fully herself in a room full of people who prefer a different version is higher than the cost of disappearing a little. Dominic was not a cruel man, or at least he had never thought of himself as one, and I had for a long time agreed with his self-assessment because agreement was easier than the alternative. He was 41, a commercial real estate developer who had grown up in the particular comfort of a family that had always had enough and had therefore confused sufficiency with correctness, the belief that the way things had always been done was the way things should be done, and that any deviation from this was a form of ingratitude. His mother, Vivienne Hargrove, was 68 and ran the family's social calendar with the precision of a general and the warmth of a very well-dressed frost front. She had welcomed me into the family the way you welcome something that has arrived in the wrong size, graciously, with modifications. For 7 years, I had been modified. I had changed how I dressed for family events, how I spoke to her friends, what I cooked when we hosted, what I didn't say when she implied my career in clinical nutrition was a pleasant hobby. I had done all of this because Dominic asked me to. So not in explicit terms, but in the way that partners communicate preferences across years of shared space. A look here, a redirect there, a gradual reshaping of behavior so subtle you don't notice it happening until you check a mirror and barely recognize the posture. The posture I'd assumed in the Hargrove family was one of perpetual deference. It had taken me 6 months of weekly sessions with my therapist, Dr. Neka Ose, to fully name it. It took Petra's phone call to finally put it down. Why, the attorney I called was Judith Farnworth, who had been practicing family law in Nashville for 26 years, and who was, in the words of a friend who had used her in her own divorce, the most methodical human being I have ever encountered, and absolutely the person you want in your corner when things get complicated. I had first contacted Judith 4 months before Thanksgiving, not because I had decided to file for divorce, but because Dr. Ose had suggested I consult with an attorney the way you might have a smoke detector inspected, not because you're planning to set anything on fire, but because you want to know what the protocol is if something goes wrong. Judith had reviewed our marriage assets, the prenuptial agreement Dominic's family attorney had drafted before our wedding, the one I'd signed at 29 without my own representation, because Dominic had said it was standard and I had been young enough to believe that love made legal documents a formality. And she had looked at me across her conference table and said, "This agreement has 3 provisions that are unenforceable under current Tennessee law. I want you to be aware of that." I had filed that information away the way you file things you hope you never need. I needed it now. When I called Judith on the morning before Thanksgiving and told her what I'd learned from Petra, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "How cooked is the turkey?" I told her it was still brining. She said, "Can you be in my office in 45 minutes?" I said yes. I put the turkey back in the refrigerator and drove downtown. Judith's office was in a building on Broadway that had the particular energy of a place where consequential decisions happen without ceremony. Clean conference rooms, good coffee, staff who had learned to be professionally neutral in the presence of people experiencing the worst days of their lives. We sat across from each other for 2 hours. I told her everything in the order it had happened, and the telling of it was, in its own way, the beginning of the ending, because once I laid it out chronologically, from the prenuptial agreement through 7 years of family dinners and modified behavior, and my husband choosing his mother's version of events over mine every time the 2 versions diverged, the shape of it was unmistakable. Not dramatic, not abusive in the spectacular way that stories about bad marriages tend to be. Just a slow, sustained erosion of a person I used to be. Judith listened to all of it with the focused patience of a woman who has heard 1,000 variations of this particular story and understands that the details matter even when the structure is familiar. At the end, she said, "The Thanksgiving situation is legally not the issue. The issue is the asset disclosure questions I flagged 4 months ago. Has anything changed on that front?" I told her yes. I told her what I had found 3 weeks prior in a shared filing cabinet in our home office, how documents I had not been meant to find, documents that had changed the nature of every conversation Judith and I had had since. She opened her legal pad and said, "Tell me everything." The documents I found in our home office filing cabinet in early November changed what had been, until that point, a story about a difficult marriage into something with legal dimensions I had not anticipated. Down the filing cabinet had a drawer I'd never opened because Dominic kept it locked, and I had no reason to need it. It was labeled business. and I had trusted, as I had trusted so many things, that business was his domain. But in early November, the lock had been left open, whether accidentally or from some lapse in the perpetual vigilance that keeping secrets requires, and I had opened it while looking for a USB drive that turned out to be somewhere else entirely. What I found, in a manila folder near the back of the drawer, was a set of documents related to a property, a condominium in Brentwood that I did not know we owned, or rather, that Dominic owned. Under an LLC formed 14 months prior, 8 months before we had begun, very tentatively, discussing whether our marriage had run its course. A condo valued at $640,000. Not on the asset disclosure Judith had requested from Dominic's counsel 4 months ago, when I had first begun the consultation process. Not on the joint tax returns we had filed together for the past 3 years, because the LLC had been structured to make the income and expenses disappear into an entity that existed technically on its own. I had photographed every page of every document in that folder with my phone before returning it to its place. I had not said a single word to Dominic. I had called Judith from a parking lot 2 blocks from our house and described what I'd found, and she had been quiet for a moment and then said, in a tone I hadn't heard from her before, "Celeste, I need you to listen to me very carefully." She retained a forensic accountant before the week was out. The forensic accountant's name was Raymond Chu, a CPA with 30 years of experience who specialized in asset tracing and financial forensics in contested divorce proceedings. Raymond had the affect of a man who had spent 3 decades looking at numbers that told stories other people were trying to hide, which made him simultaneously the least surprised and most precise person in any room he occupied. He reviewed the LLC documentation, cross-referenced it with property records, tax filings, and bank statements that Judith obtained through a formal discovery request that Dominic's attorney, a man named Stuart Okafor, who was, by all accounts, excellent and who was now in the uncomfortable position of realizing his client had not been fully forthcoming with him either, could not block without making things significantly worse. What Raymond found, documented in a 63-page report he delivered to Judith 10 days before Thanksgiving, was not just the Brentwood condo, it was a pattern. 2 additional LLCs formed in the previous 2 years. A total of approximately $1.1 million in assets that had been structured to exist outside the marital estate during the period in which Dominic had been, by his own account in couples therapy, working on our marriage. We had been in couples therapy for 8 months. The couples therapist, Dr. Gerald Moss, who had 30 years of practice in marital counseling and had worked with both of us in good faith, he had noted in his records, which Judith had requested as part of a broader document collection, that Dominic had consistently presented himself as committed to reconciliation while displaying what Dr. Moss called a pattern of strategic withholding that is inconsistent with genuine therapeutic engagement. Raymond Chu called it something else, something that had a cleaner legal definition. Judith had filed for divorce on my behalf the Monday before Thanksgiving. The papers were served to Dominic's attorney that afternoon. Dominic had not yet told me they'd been served, which told me everything I needed to know about how the next 24 hours were going to go. I want to be precise about the sequence of events on Thanksgiving morning because the precision is the point. I woke at 5:30 a.m. in the guest room of our house, where I had been sleeping for 6 weeks, a geographic fact of our marriage's final chapter that Dominic had presented to his family as evidence of my emotional instability, and that I had not corrected because correcting it would have required telling them things I wasn't ready for them to know yet. At 6 a.m., I began cooking. This requires explanation. Thanksgiving at the Hargrove house had been my production for 6 of the 7 years of our marriage. The first year, Vivian had cooked and it had been a command performance with no room for contribution, and in the second year I had offered to help, and the help had been accepted with such grudging precision that I understood I was being permitted rather than welcomed, and by the third year I had simply arrived with enough food to cover the entire meal, and Vivian had pivoted gracefully and without acknowledgement, from treating my cooking as an intrusion to presenting it to her guests as a feature of her household's traditions. I had made her table extraordinary for 5 years without credit, and with only the occasional sincere compliment from Dominic's aunt, or a family friend who didn't know enough to be careful about praising me in front of Vivienne. I cooked the entire meal that morning. 17-pound heritage turkey, 4 side dishes, 2 pies, a cranberry relish from a recipe my grandmother had made in her kitchen in Knoxville when I was 7 years old. I cooked all of it. And at 12:30 p.m. I loaded it into my car and drove to the Hargrove house. The divorce papers printed by Judith's paralegal and couriered to me the previous evening in a sealed envelope were in my bag. Dominic's car was in the driveway when I arrived at 1 p.m., so were 2 cars I didn't recognize, the Forests and the Aldermans. The table fillers Vivian had invited to replace me. The front door was unlocked, which it always was on Thanksgiving, the one day of the year Vivian's formality relaxed enough to allow for the casual warmth of an open door. I carried the food in through the back entrance, the one off the kitchen, which I knew would be unoccupied at this hour because Vivian's caterer. She had started using a caterer 3 years into my cooking tenure. We, for the appetizer hour, cleared out before the main meal. I set everything on the counter and went back to the car for the second load. By the time I had finished bringing in the food, I had been in the house for 11 minutes without anyone noticing, which was an achievement in a house with 9 people and an open floor plan. But grief and shock have a way of making people blind to things that don't fit their expectation of events. I put the turkey in the oven to stay warm and began arranging the sides in their serving dishes, and I was doing this when Vivian walked into the kitchen at 1:22 p.m. and stopped so completely she looked like a film that had been paused. She was wearing a navy dress and pearls. She was holding a wine glass. Her face cycled through several expressions in rapid succession. Surprise, then confusion, then something I can only describe as the specific alarm of a woman who has made a plan that has just encountered reality. Celeste, she said. Nothing else. Just my name, in the tone of someone who had expected to say it much later, and under very different circumstances. Vivienne, I said, and I went back to arranging the sweet potato casserole. What followed was the most surreal 40 minutes of my adult life. And I have spent subsequent months in therapy processing the specific texture of that surreality, which Dr. Osi says is a normal response to an experience that combines acute emotional stress with the dissonance of performing domestic normalcy while your entire life reorganizes itself around you. Vivienne retreated to the dining room, and I could hear her speaking in a low, controlled voice to Dominic, who I heard move from the living room where he had apparently been having drinks with the Forrests. I heard his footsteps in the hallway. I heard them stop outside the kitchen door. I kept working. He came in at 1:35 p.m. and stood in the doorway in the gray cashmere sweater he wore every Thanksgiving, and the sight of him in that sweater, the familiarity of it, the way it represented 6 years of this specific day, compressed something in my chest that I refused to let reach my face. He said, Celeste, what are you doing here? I said, I'm finishing the cranberry relish. Can you check the turkey? He stared at me. I looked back at him with the steady expression of a woman who has spent 3 months preparing for this specific moment. He said, My mother said you weren't coming. I said, I know what your mother said. I turned back to the relish. He stood in the doorway for another 10 seconds without speaking, which told me that whatever he had planned to say, he hadn't planned for this version of me. Then his mother appeared behind him and touched his arm and said they should talk, and they went, and I finished the relish. Dinner was served at 2 p.m. I put the food on the table myself, the way I had done for 5 years, in the order I had always used, turkey at the center, sides arranged around it in the pattern Vivienne had specified in my second year, and that I had simply memorized and maintained because it was easier than fighting for the right to arrange casserole dishes differently. The Forrests were a couple in their late 60s named Bart and Constance, who had known the Hargroves for 20 years, and who looked at me with the cautious politeness of people who have been told a version of events and are now confronting evidence that the version may have been incomplete. The Aldermans were younger, early 50s, newer to the Hargrove social circle, and they had the wide-eyed quality of guests who had arrived expecting a pleasant holiday dinner and had instead walked into something they didn't have the context to fully interpret. Dominic's father, Lawrence Hargrove, 72 years old and the quietest member of his own family, sat at the head of the table and looked at his hands. Petra was there, and she caught my eye once briefly, with an expression that was equal parts guilt and something that might have been relief. I sat in my usual chair, across from Dominic, and I unfolded my napkin and placed it in my lap, and the table went quiet in the way that tables do when everyone present knows that something is happening and no one is willing to be the first to acknowledge it. I reached into my bag, which I had hung on the back of my chair, and I took out the envelope. I set it on the table in front of me. I picked up my fork. I said, Should we say grace? Vivienne said grace. We began to eat. The envelope sat next to my plate for 22 minutes. I know because I checked the time at 2:01 when we started, and I checked it again at 2:23 when I decided the meal had gone on long enough and the performance of normalcy had served its purpose. In those 22 minutes, the conversation had been careful and sparse, and weighted with the specific quality of talk between people who are orbiting something they've agreed not to name. Bart Forrest asked about a renovation project the Hargroves had mentioned. Constance complimented the turkey, looking at Vivienne, who accepted the compliment with a smile and did not correct the attribution. Lawrence talked about the weather for a while with the determined focus of a man who has learned that weather is the safest possible topic at a table in which something invisible is building. Dominic said almost nothing. He sat across from me, cutting his turkey into precise pieces and not eating most of them, and every time his eyes moved toward the envelope on the table next to my plate, I watched him make the decision not to ask about it, which was its own kind of answer to a question I hadn't posed yet. At 2:23, I set down my fork. I picked up the envelope. I slid it across the table and it came to rest against the turkey platter, which was a detail I had not planned, but which was so precisely right that I had to work to keep my face neutral. I said, Dominic, Judith Farnworth's office sent those to Stuart Okafor's office Monday afternoon. I wanted to make sure you had a copy. The table stopped. Everything stopped. Even the particular ambient sound of a dining room, silverware, breathing, the furnace, seemed to pause. Dominic looked at the envelope. Then he looked at me. He said very quietly, Celeste. I said, Haha, happy Thanksgiving. I picked up my fork and finished my meal. The next 15 minutes operated at a frequency I don't have adequate language for. Vivienne identified the situation before Dominic said another word. She was, whatever her other qualities, a woman of exceptional social intelligence, and the word Farnworth had clearly registered. And she did what she always did when a situation exceeded her control. She pivoted. She turned to Bart Forrest and began a conversation about the country club's renovation that she had apparently abandoned mid-thought 22 minutes ago, and the performance of normalcy she attempted in that moment was technically impressive and emotionally horrifying in equal measure. Lawrence excused himself from the table and went to the kitchen, which was something I had never seen him do in 7 years of these dinners. The aldermans looked at each other. Petra stared at the table. Dominic did not open the envelope at the table. He sat with it in front of him in his jaw set, and the cashmere sweater that I had seen on Thanksgiving 6 times suddenly looked like a costume, which I suppose it always had been. I finished eating, placed my napkin on the table, and said I hoped everyone enjoyed the meal. I thanked Constance Forrest for the company. I picked up my bag. I walked out through the kitchen, past Lawrence, who was standing at the counter staring at nothing in particular, and I said goodbye to him quietly, and he nodded once and didn't say anything, and I thought that was probably the most honest response anyone in that house had offered me in 7 years. I drove home. I was on the highway when the phone rang. Dominic called at 3:41 p.m., I know because my car's display showed the time when his name came up. I let it ring 3 times, which is the amount of time required to decide with certainty what you want to say before you say it. Then I answered. He didn't start with my name this time. He started with, "How long have you known about the Brentwood property?" I found this interesting. Not, "I can explain," or "We need to talk." He went straight to the thing he thought I had on him, which told me his attorney had been in contact and he understood what the document in the envelope actually meant. But I told him I'd known for 6 weeks. He asked how. I told him the filing cabinet had been unlocked. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "I never wanted it to be like this." I told him I believed that, and I meant it because I did. Dominic had never wanted anything to be the way it actually was, which was precisely the problem. He said, "My mother had nothing to do with the financial decisions. Whatever you found, that was me. That was my choice. Leave her out of it." I said I had no interest in his mother beyond the context of my marriage to him, which had now concluded. He said, "Celeste, is there any way to—" I said, "Judith will handle everything from here. If you have questions, Stuart can reach out to her office." He said my name one more time, just my name. The way you say something when you've run out of things to say but can't bring yourself to stop. I said, "Dominic, I made your family Thanksgiving dinner for 5 years. I cooked in my own kitchen this morning for 6 hours, starting at 6 a.m., and I brought the food to a house where your mother had told everyone I wouldn't be. I want you to think about what that required of me, and then I want you to tell me what you think I still owe you." He didn't answer. I said goodbye and disconnected. The divorce proceedings moved in the way that well-prepared cases move when one side has significantly more documentation than the other side expected them to have. Stuart Okafor, who was, by Judith's account, a professional operating under the constraint of a client who had made choices his counsel hadn't known about, reached out to Judith's office the Friday after Thanksgiving with a request to discuss settlement parameters. The conversation that followed over the next 6 weeks was, in Judith's words, productive, which in legal terms means the opposing side understood what the discovery process would reveal and preferred to control the narrative through negotiation rather than expose it in proceedings. Raymond Chu's forensic report documented $1.1 million in concealed assets across the 3 LLCs, plus income diversion that had been occurring for 22 months. The prenuptial agreement, with its 3 unenforceable provisions, was essentially unusable as a shield. Stuart Okafor was a good attorney. He knew it. The settlement was reached in January, finalized in February, and I'm not going to describe the financial terms because they are mine and they are sufficient, and they belong to the chapter of my life that comes after this story rather than inside it. What I will say is that Judith Farnworth shook my hand at the conclusion of our final meeting and said, "You were one of the most prepared clients I've ever worked with." I told her I'd had a good teacher. She said, "You taught yourself. I just ran the numbers." Dr. Neka Osei had been my therapist for 14 months before Thanksgiving, and she was the person I called on the evening of Thanksgiving itself, after I'd come home from the highway, after the call with Dominic, after I'd sat in my kitchen for an hour with the lights off eating leftover cranberry relish from a spoon because I hadn't actually eaten much of my own dinner at the table. She answered because she had told me at the beginning of our work together that I could call on holidays, that in her experience the particular weight of holidays on people in difficult family situations justified the exception, and she had been right about this as she had been right about most things. I told her what had happened. She listened. At the end, she asked how my body felt. I considered this. I said my shoulders were lower than they'd been in months. She said, "Tell me about that." I told her that the thing about performing deference for 7 years is that it sits in your skeleton, in the specific tension of holding yourself at an angle that doesn't come naturally, and that something about the afternoon, the cooking, the drive, the envelope sliding across the table, the drive home, see the call, had released that tension in a way I hadn't expected and wasn't sure I fully understood yet. She said, "You showed up." I said, "I brought turkey." She said, "You showed up as yourself. That's different from anything you'd done in that house in a very long time." I ate another spoonful of cranberry relish and looked out the kitchen window at the November dark and thought about my grandmother's recipe, about the way she'd made it every year in her kitchen in Knoxville with her hands and no written instructions, about all the things you carry forward from the people who loved you without conditions. The relish was exactly right. It had always been exactly right. I had just been making it for the wrong table. The first Thanksgiving after my divorce I spent in Knoxville, in the kitchen of my Aunt Deborah, who had known me since birth and who made space at her table without ceremony and without conditions. I brought cranberry relish, I brought a pie. I did not bring a performance of anyone I wasn't. My aunt had 13 people at her table, and she seated me next to a woman named Frances Obie, who had been her friend for 30 years, and who asked me, with the direct curiosity of someone who has earned the right to ask anything, what I did for work, and when I told her clinical nutrition, my own practice, 12 years of building something that had nothing to do with Dominic or Vivienne, she leaned forward and asked 3 excellent follow-up questions, and we talked for 40 minutes while the rest of the table hummed around us, and I felt for the first time in longer than I could precisely calculate, like the full version of myself was present in the room and was welcome there. The turkey was someone else's. It was fine. For some tables don't require you to earn your place with labor. Some tables just open and let you sit. I had forgotten this was possible, which is, I think, the most important thing the previous year had taught me. Not the legal lessons or the financial ones, though those were real and necessary, but this, that the work of belonging should not feel like a debt you spend a decade trying to repay. You sit down. You pass the relish. You are there. That is enough. That has always been enough. It just took me 7 years and one very specific Thanksgiving to understand it completely. If you made it to the end of this, you already know why it mattered. Hit like if you've ever brought the food to the wrong table and finally figured out how to find the right one.